From TRICHOMES.com, I'm Jarod Duggins, and this is the Careers in Cannabis podcast. On this show, we will be talking to staffing agencies, cannabis companies, and seasoned traditional market executives in order to explore and obtain a better grasp of the current employment opportunities and what we might be able to expect of the burgeoning cannabis industry. Today marks the second Careers in Cannabis podcast episode, and before we begin today's interview, I'd like to again start with the most recent calculations concerning the national unemployment rate. At the close of the markets yesterday, Bloomberg reported that another 2.98 million working adults filed for unemployment since our first podcast, bringing the 8-week total estimated 36.5 million Americans out of work. I'd also like to note that while I personally have chosen a lifelong career in cannabis, TRICHOMES.com itself has just recently made its public debut. We are here to clarify the narrative surrounding cannabis in general, but recently we also saw a twofold need arise from the current COVID-19 devastation. The way we will be globally affected has just begun to show. The opposite and equal effects of what will become from what has already transpired is what remains the biggest question. And while I'd like to think that the reason for our industry being deemed essential is a compassionate decision made by our esteemed government leaders, reality is that cannabis is one of the largest growing industries nationally, and that means revenue to the state, pure and simple. Regardless of the why, the two things everyone needs to know are, number one, the cannabis industry will be here tomorrow. And number two is that with every passing month and every new state that passes new laws, we need good people with backgrounds that can support the scaling of an industry that is actually growing at a faster rate than we have people for right now. That being said, this show is for those not knowing what their next move is, but know that they need to make one. I thank you for joining us. We are joined today by David Belsky, founder of Flowerhire, a staffing agency with offices in LA and New York. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jarod.
Hey, to start things out, full disclosure, I'm actually sitting here in my recording booth, aka my walk-in closet, having the clothes kind of cut down on the reverb that we normally would get in the sound booth at the office. Just checking in before we get into the conversation. How are you doing, and how have you been holding up personally through the quarantine?
It's definitely been an adjustment. I have 3 kids at some homeschooling track at home, and it's a lot, but fortunately we're all healthy and safe. So I just take it day by day and appreciate what's important.
Great to hear. And you mentioned the change that is inevitable when you have things happen and people stay home. Previous to COVID life, Flowerhire was around, and I had been hearing about you guys making moves throughout the industry. Of recent times, in the last couple of months, I've been hearing more and more about Flowerhire and what you had been doing across the industry. Had COVID changed your positioning or your thought process over the last couple of months, or how are you addressing that?
That's a great question. I think, I've been focusing on executive search and cannabis for 3 years. And, over the past year, being a California-based company, we've transitioned to really truly being a national company with an East Coast office. And I always knew that talent was going to be the driving force of this emerging industry moving forward, because no strategy is going to work without the people to implement it. And this is a really hard industry to work in. And obviously running a recruiting business in a time when 30 million people have lost their jobs is not for the faint of heart. However, I felt like with the essential services designation and everything else, if anything, on the other side of COVID, growth is going to accelerate because I think states are going to be incentivized to find more revenue and produce more jobs. And, I saw something that said, according to New Frontier data, if cannabis was federally legal, there'd be 1.5 million people working in this industry. So that's a lot of jobs. So I'm even more, bullish on the potential of this industry than ever before.
Oh yeah, that is a lot of jobs. It's a lot of staffing. You mentioned, the East Coast, and I know from when we were talking earlier, you have offices in Los Angeles and New York. Can you tell me a little bit about the difference that you're seeing in the needs of the markets over there? I mean, primarily you're seeing, I know we're recreationally based, I guess, over here on the West Coast now, and primarily you got a lot of medical markets, New York, something of its own. What's going on?
I think that the great thing is we're past the stigma of working in cannabis largely. Obviously on the West Coast where people have been working in it for longer, but even on the East Coast, it seems like people are kind of ready for legal cannabis, which is great. I think that the industry on the East Coast is just a little bit more nascent in a lot of places. So it's still very much picks and shovels, meaning let's get plants in the ground and let's open up stores. And then the market will mature and we'll develop brands and have distribution and all those other things down the road. Right. Versus the West Coast, which is just been a more established market. You know, you have some legal markets that have been open here for years. And so in a lot of ways, differentiation and specialization are what the operators are doing on the West Coast. So it's just, there's a little bit more advanced is probably the wrong word, but mature. And, you know, East Coast are really primarily focusing on just getting operations off the ground.
Definitely great observations and insights. And within that, you mentioned, you know, getting the operations off the ground versus a bit more of a mature market. For our listeners that are maybe considering cannabis for the first time or hearing about Flowerhire for the first time, what would you say is Flowerhire's wheelhouse as far as staffing or placement of individuals?
You know, we've worked with everything from like marquee brands to multi-state operators, really spanning all aspects of the cannabis vertical. Our sweet spot in terms of position is C-level down to sort of experienced salaried professional. So, you know, 70 to 100K salaried positions on the low end up to, you know, your CFO, CEO, general counsel, and everything in between, both on a retained and a contingent basis. So those and within that sort of lane, we've probably filled almost any role of strategic value in the cannabis industry across, you know, not only executive ranks but marketing, you know, operations, compliance, and HR, and legal, and sales, and even, you know, the plant specific ones around extraction, formulations, and cultivation.
Gotcha. You know, and so within that, you mentioned plant specific and plant specific or plant touching versus ancillary. You mentioned picks and shovels earlier. Are you seeing more placements within the plant touching or the ancillary services right now?
Definitely the plant touching. If you go back, you know, 3 years, it was the ancillary companies that raised money the quickest. And so they were kind of the first companies that we worked with before really pivoting more into plant touching 2 years ago. But right now, the majority of our customers are plant touching operators across the country.
Nice. Well, you know, it's interesting and obviously compared to a few of the conversations I have in and surrounding careers in cannabis as a podcast, not only formally as the show, but surrounding it informally, just in conversation, is you have the unique perspective of being on the East Coast, West Coast, as it's going from, again, being a more mature market into something of a developing market. Within that, you're seeing this top level of employee or candidate that you're looking at. Are there any traits or specific backgrounds or experience levels that you're seeing in your top hires or top placements?
You know, if you're looking at, I look at those in two different ways, you know, skills and attitude, right? From a skills standpoint, the areas of demand we see the most of are people that have scaled out operations, whether that's in a cultivation capacity, whether that's in a kind of supply chain, you know, manufacturing capacity, people that know how to build systems in order to promote growth. You know, outside of that, you know, general counsels, chief financial officers, cost accounting, those are probably the most common type of roles that we see. Although, again, we see many outside of that too. And if you're looking at like the type of industry that a lot of the people that have come into cannabis, you know, have come out of, that are especially more management or executive ranks, it's manufacturing, CPG specifically, food, alcohol, tobacco, agriculture, retail. Those are really the most common industries that people come from before cannabis in those type of strategic roles. If you're thinking about like attitude, I think what I've identified as kind of core characteristics of people that make good hires in this industry, specifically in leadership roles, they got to believe in the plant. They don't have to be a recreational user. They just need to believe they're on the right side of history, believe it's medicine, believe it shouldn't be illegal, because ultimately all of these companies are still mission driven in their core around that. So aligning culturally is important. You don't have to be, and we've placed a lot of sober-minded people in this industry, CFOs, general counsels that are definitely not users, but have their story, their cannabis story about why cannabis. So usually people have some type of cannabis story. The second thing is they need to have done like startup work before, like they had to have operated without a net before, right? It doesn't have to be, an entrepreneur, but like somebody who's been through a company that's a startup or has gone through hyper growth, or they've done turnarounds, they've been consultants for a variety of companies. Because what I found is that if no one's worked in a startup pace, in a startup environment before, and they're trying to learn cannabis and how to work in cannabis, there's too much to take on. So that operating without a net before, and realizing that in true hypergrowth form, the job never ends. It is a 24-hour-a-day job. And the third one is just appreciating the moment in history, like as a capitalist, or just realizing you're on the ground floor of an emerging industry, and that excitement and that buzz, believing in that, right? It's just not looking for another job. It's you got to appreciate the moment in history.
Tremendous insights, and I think invaluable to anybody listening and considering cannabis for the first time. This is something that we, I guess we lend towards endearing in thought at TRICHOMES.com is staying with the narrative created by the people who've brought the industry to where it's at. The people that are at the table today, whether they joined in the last couple of years or have been legacy producers and generational farmers from different parts of, the country, is the pursuit of doing something better for the plant is what we all have in common at the moment. And it's imperative that we continue participating in this narrative. So, those points that you just brought up, I do believe are valid for people to consider as they're coming into this.
I completely agree. And I think there's a character trait, humble, because at the end of the day, if you work in this industry, at some point, you're going to either realize for the first time or be put in a situation where you're talking to somebody who went to jail for 5 years, who lost their life savings, because of this plant. And the modern industry kind of stands on the back of all of those previous efforts. So you just have to pay homage to that. And there's nothing like that. There's no essential service out there that's still federally illegal. Like nothing makes sense in this industry. You just got to be ready for that.
Yeah, boy, could we go down a rabbit hole on that conversation? But we are here to talk about careers in cannabis, not the history of that. But 100%. And might I add just real quick is that wanting what's best for the plant and the community and the medicine that's inevitably going to arise from it isn't synonymous with smoking 2 bowls in the morning and smoking 2 bowls at night. It's not about being a stoner. It's not about necessarily participating. It's about believing in the efficacy. It's about believing in a better tomorrow, contributing factors, and or basically the daily value of life being better through the use of cannabinoids. And ultimately, even if it doesn't affect you in that way, knowing that it does affect someone in a positive fashion is something that's a prerequisite to coming into the industry and being successful. I think you hit that nail on the head. So thanks for bringing that up.
No problem. I mean, I love that you just quoted Sublime, by the way.
Got to.
but it's true. There's a reason why this plant is medically legal in over 30 states across the country, is because people get medical value from it. And actually being excited about being able to provide some scientific rigor and actual gather real data about how people use this plant and how it helps them, is only going to help to make the world a better place.
Yep. Well, David, these points and insights you're bringing up are invaluable to our quest to bring new talent into the industry and the right type of talent. We need people from all callings to help our industry grow into what it's going to become. And, some of these, I guess you can grow into the role, but some of these insights you provided today are imperative. And whether it helps 1, 2, 3, or 4 people, as I've said on the previous podcast, 4 more people, that's what it's intended to do, is help people understand that there are some jobs and opportunities in cannabis that possibly weren't considered before. And it takes all types to help an industry become what it's going to become.
Absolutely. I mean, no matter what, money, you can transfer that fairly easily to companies, but people and hiring people is critical. A company in this industry is only as good as the people that can follow through and implement a strategy. So, I actually look at this as the largest workforce mobilization since World War II. To go from 200,000 people now employed in cannabis to 1.5 million in potentially the next 3 to 5 years, it's going to take a lot of just hiring. I mean, at scale.
Definitely. And, there's other numbers, and we're going to get into it with one of our future guests in the next shows is let's talk about the veteran population, of which prior to COVID was down an all-time low number of just 2.5% of the veteran population out of work, and it skyrocketed to over 13% currently. So that's a conversation we as an industry got to get into as well. So maybe we can talk about that on one of our next shows, David.
Great.
When it comes down to how to get a hold of Flowerhire, where to find you guys, is there a best way to get to see what Flowerhire has to offer?
Absolutely. I would go to our website, which is just flowerhire.com. You'll be able to see, if you look at our blog, lots of webinars that we put together for the industry. If you click on, our careers page, you can see what jobs we're working. My email address is david@flowerhire.com. If you want to get in touch with me, probably the best way.
And David, just to remind all of our listeners, is the founder of flowerhire.com. So David, thanks for putting your email out on our show. No takebacks. You're being recorded.
Right. I've taken a page from Neil Linson's book. When Neil was laid off or let go or separated from Canopy, he spoke at the NCIA event in San Jose last year in June or July, and he basically on a screen in front of 1,000+ people put his phone number and said, "I'm open for jobs." So Neil Linson does it, I'll do it.
Hey, when it comes down to doing it best, usually one of our predecessors has done it before. So, when it comes down to our continued conversation, I look forward to having you back to Careers in Cannabis on TRICHOMES and figuring out, where the highest rate of unemployment and this era in history is going to take us, and how cannabis as an industry, as a burgeoning industry, as a growing industry, can contribute to ratifying the problem. David, again, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
You can follow our series, Careers in Cannabis, as well as more great shows like this one at trichomes.com. If you're a member of the cannabis community and you have a story you want to share with us, reach out. You can reach the show at careersincannabis@trichomes.com. Please take a second to subscribe to the podcast and write a review. It really helps others find the show. You can also join in the discussion with other industry professionals and have your voice heard by joining the community at trichomes.com and following us on all social media. Thank you for listening.